Hello, welcome to Guide London. My name's Nick Salmond. I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide, one of the over 600 members of the Association of Professional Tourist Guides, and that's the people behind the Guide London website. Now, over the lockdown period, we've been doing a series of live broadcasts, bringing you a little bit of London. We've told you about its history, about its culture, and about some of the people who've lived here. All our broadcasts, over 40 of them, are available on our YouTube channel. Just go to Guide London and search for our broadcast there. But London's starting to open up. People are coming to visit the city once more. So as London opens up, we'll be telling you about some of the places you can visit. Some of them very famous buildings. We visited the Tower of London a few weeks ago. Some of them quite small museums that are equally intriguing. Last week we visited the old operating theatre in Herb Garrett, just south of the River Thames, and had a fascinating look around the museum and seeing how they're coping with opening up to the public once more. Today we've got another tiny museum that we're looking at, and it's a museum dedicated to the life of one particular gentleman, and that is the author Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is, of course, one of our most famous authors. He did so much to bring 19th century London into people's consciousness. He wrote about the lives of the people in the city here, not just the lives of the upper classes, but the lives of the ordinary street urchin as well. His books are read the world over and have been made into many, many film and television series. Charles Dickens lived in many different houses during his time in London. Most of those houses have been demolished over the years, but there was one that's still standing. If we look at the map of central London, you can see up on the Marylebone Road there is a Charles Dickens memorial. That is a montage of some of the characters from some of his books, and it stands on the site where one of the houses he used to occupy used to stand. It's now been demolished. Over on Woburn Place you will find a blue plaque to another of Dickens' residences, but over here just to the east in Doughty Street you will find a home that's still standing that was occupied by Charles Dickens, and that is now the home of the Charles Dickens Museum. Dickens lived here from March of 1837 up until December of 1839, so 2.5 years. He moved in with a young family, a young son, and his wife gave birth to 2 daughters while he was living in the house. And it was here that he completed the great work of fiction we know as Pickwick Papers, and it was here that he wrote the books Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby. Now, the museum has been closed for the last few months during lockdown, as most museums in London have been. It opened up to the public last Saturday, and we were very privileged to be invited along for the opening. In just a moment, we'll be talking to the director of the museum. But first, I'm going to hand over to my Blue Badge tourist guide, Tim Hudson, who's going to give us a little look around the museum.
Charles Dickens is one of the greatest writers in the history of English literature. He wrote 14 major novels, numerous newspaper and magazine articles, gave lectures, went on tour performing highlights and greatest hits from his novels, and he left us with an unforgettable legacy of immortal characters. I'm sure you've got your favourite, whether it's Miss Havisham, the eternal bride in Great Expectation, or Mr. Micawber, always waiting for something to turn up in David Copperfield, or perhaps from A Christmas Carol is the miserly Ebenezer Scrooge. So, let's go inside and encounter Charles Dickens. So we're standing in the ground floor dining room, just looking through the open door into the hallway, and you can see on the wall a splendid clock which came from Gad's Hill Place, which was the last home of Dickens. He died there on the 9th of June, 1870. And that's another great thing about the Charles Dickens Museum, is it collects items associated with Dickens from other places. But here in the dining room, you can see the dinner table is set for dinner for a number of quite distinguished guests. We have William Makepeace Thackeray. He was the author of Vanity Fair, who fondly referred to Dickens as Mr. Popular Sentiment. We have here his great friend, John Forster, from whom we've learnt so much about the novelist. Catherine Dickens at the head of the table. Here's William Mccready, one of the great tragedians. Dickens was a great actor. In fact, if he hadn't been ill and missed the audition at a theatre in Covent Garden, he may well have embarked on a stage career rather than that of writing novels. Daniel Maclise, a great artist. And you can see a picture of Dickens by Samuel Drummond. It's one of many pictures of him here, and a portrait bust, if we just pan around there as well, showing Dickens very much as the dandy. We tend to think of Dickens as a Victorian novelist, but in fact this house was built in the early 1800s during the Regency period, and so Dickens was very much of that time. He enjoyed showing off his fashionable dress. And here, of course, at the dinner table, he would hold people spellbound by his histrionic conversation. Now, we're going to move into another room now, so come along with me. We've come to the morning room, which was very much the domain of Catherine Dickens, whose charming portrait is on the wall there. And if we just look down, you can see some very fine needlework. She was very accomplished. And also the engagement ring with its 7 turquoise stones. Mr. and Mrs. Dickens above the fireplace. Catherine Dickens bore him 10 children. So he was a very demanding husband in many ways. It began as a very happy marriage, but later on it went a bit sour. All kinds of mementos of Dickens fill the room. So we're standing in the wash house of Dickens' home at 48 Doughty Street, and right in front of you is the copper. And of course the copper features in one of the most famous passages from A Christmas Carol, when Mrs. Cratchit produces the phenomenon of the Christmas pudding. So I'm just going to read this short extract. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Well, it just doesn't get more authentic than that. We are here in the copper, where that incident would have happened for real during Dickens' occupancy of the house in the 1830s. Ben Nolan is a volunteer here at the Charles Dickens Museum. Hi, Ben. So tell us a little about the place we're in now.
Okay, so we're in the kitchen down here in the basement of the house. Very busy place during Dickens' time, and a very unpleasant place during Dickens' time. Would have been very hot, the fire would have been raging most of the day, soot, dirt, heat, and lots of vermin everywhere on the floor, creepy crawlies, insects, and so on. And so, like many Victorian kitchens, it had a resident. If you look over towards the fire, you see the Hedgehog. This particular one, unsurprisingly, called Bill Spikes. And his job would have been to help, try and clear up some of that lively infestations that would have been going around the floors here. He's sitting underneath a very interesting piece of furniture there. That's a meat hastener, as they were often known, or a meat screen. And the joint of meat would be placed in there, it would rotate, and it'd be placed in front of the roaring fire. And there's a little door there at the back so that a rod could be pushed through, see how the meat was cooking. So very, very busy. The servants here would have been up and down the house, bringing water, bringing food. Little bell system. Very interesting thing was discovered in 2012 when they did the renovations here. If you just look right into that corner where the plaster is worn away, there's the remains of the bell system. And they believe that was part of the original system there. So the servants could be getting on with their other chores down here, and if they were required by the family, the bell would ring and off they trotted upstairs.
And do you think Dickens would have been a good master? Would he have been popular with the staff?
I believe so. We call them servants, but I think probably more staff was more appropriate for Dickens's time. He was very popular with his staff. Unlike many employers in Victorian times, Dickens was quite liked by his staff, and many of them, if they were literate, would read his works as well and see how sympathetically people like them were often portrayed.
Yes. And of course he loved his food. His novels are full of wonderful descriptions.
He loved his food. Catherine Dickens was a great cook.
Yeah.
She loved cooking. Along there you'll see things such as jelly moulds. She loved making jellies, all sorts of experimental recipes that she tried out. Custards very popular in the Victorian times, often eaten out of a cup or a bowl as a dessert. So she produced a cookbook actually called What Shall We Have for Dinner, which has quite an amusing introduction by Dickens if you get the chance to read it. And of course a very well-stocked wine cellar, and further down the corridor here towards the washroom we have an extremely well-stocked wine cellar, a little bit past its best perhaps, in wine, but certainly vintage.
Fantastic. And congratulations on reopening.
Thanks very much. Enjoy your visit.
Well, if like me you love books, then this is the Holy of Holies, Dickens' study. And you're looking down at the very desk, which was originally at Dickens' last home, Gad's Hill Place, at which he wrote three of his greatest novels, Our Mutual Friend, A Tale of Two Cities, and Great Expectations. And looking around you, you can see the bookcases, which are stuffed with first editions of his work. As I mentioned earlier, Dickens published in serial form, and that generated the excitement and the passion of his audience, but later on he would assiduously edit all his work. So there was nothing lackadaisical about it. It all came under the very careful scrutiny of the writer. And if we just go into the adjoining room, to the drawing room, which comes from withdraw. So Dickens's guests would retire after dinner into this place. And I want to show you something really special. If you just look in front of you there, you can see the reading desk. And here you can imagine Dickens putting his heart and soul into the public readings of his work, his greatest hits, which drew huge audiences. And it exacted a terrible toll of the author. He would enter into the predicament of Nancy, who was being murdered by Bill Sikes in Oliver Twist. Very lucrative, of course, these readings, but as I say, very exacting on Dickens' health, hence his tragic early death. So we've come to the exhibition room at the Charles Dickens Museum, and there are changing exhibitions here which throw light on different aspects of Dickens' life and work. And at the moment the exhibition is Technicolor Dickens, and you can see some extraordinary, very intimate images of this famous writer which have been digitally colorized by the artist and photographer Oliver Clyde. And it really shows us a completely unexpected, very warm, as I say, intimate aspect of this great man. And now we've come to a rather poignant location. It's the room in which 17-year-old Mary Hogarth died very suddenly on the 7th of May 1837. She was Catherine Dickens' younger sister, and of course her tragic death was reused by Dickens. She became a model for many of his heroines, Rose Maylie and particularly Little Nell in the Old Curiosity Shop. And there are many other mementos of death in this room. Looking at a very poignant picture indeed, the empty chair at Gad's Hill Place. And that really evokes a sense of the great gap left by Dickens' tragic early demise. He wanted to be buried in Rochester Cathedral, but in fact Westminster Abbey was chosen, and you can see his grave there when the Abbey's open. In fact, recently, of course, it was the 150th anniversary of Dickens' death, and the west front of the Abbey was flooded with light and a wonderful image of the novelist. So we're going to finish here in the nursery of 48 Doughty Street, and of course there was a time during Dickens' occupancy when this part of the building would have resounded with the cries of children, 3 of whom lived here with their parents. Young Charles, only a few weeks old when they moved in, was shortly joined by his sisters Mary and Catherine. But just in front of you now, if I move to one side, you can see a poignant memory of Dickens' own childhood. And this is a wooden grille from the Marshalsea prison, which was a debtor's prison in Southwark, south of the River Thames. And it was here that John Dickens, Charles's father, was imprisoned because it was a crime to owe money back at that time. And it was the humiliation and the shame of this very personal family experience which fueled Dickens' social conscience. And so I suppose to sum him up, he's not just given us those remarkable characters and demonstrated the wonderful creativity of his art, but he's also got a burning social conscience, a determination to right those social evils.
Thank you very much, Tim. A fascinating look around a fascinating museum. Well, after Tim had done his look around the museum at Doughty Street, he went into the back garden, and there he talked to the museum's director, Dr. Cindy Sughrue.
So much for inviting us here to the Charles Dickens Museum on this auspicious day.
Oh, we're delighted to have you, and I can't tell you how excited we all were this morning to be opening the doors again after 4 months.
I can imagine. It must have seemed a very long time during lockdown.
It was, and it was quite emotional actually,
Yeah.
to get to this point where, you know, when we closed on the 18th of March, we didn't know when we would be reopening again and what it meant. And just that uncertainty was hard for everyone to live through.
Yeah.
So this morning, I said to one of my colleagues, I'm more excited than I am on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve is our busiest day of the year. Everyone wants to come in and be in Dickens's house at that time. And I thought, I feel that excited. And to have people coming back in, to make it feel like a house becomes a home when
Yes.
people are in it. And it
Yes.
just felt very empty and unloved during these past 4 months.
And that's interesting you should say that, because of course the writer was very home-oriented, wasn't he?
Absolutely. And when I think visitors find a focal point in the museum always around Dickens's study, it's
Yes.
where he worked. And because the world has discovered homeworking in a big way
Yes.
over these last few months, they're fascinated to say, oh, this Dickens home worked.
Yes.
You know, he was there, and in the heart of the house is his study, and he was there having friends, family, obviously, visitors, dinner parties. This was a very lively space,
Yes.
a creative space, and a lively home. And that's why I say when visitors come back in, it's breathing life
Yes.
into the building again.
I said in my introduction outside, I can't think of another historic house where the presence is so evident of the famous person who lived there.
That's absolutely right, and I think various elements contribute to that, because the historic house has been reinstated and set as it was when Dickens lived here. But also, it's not a lot of set dressing. You're seeing furniture that belonged to Dickens, his personal
Yes.
effects, the only clothing of his to survive, letters, manuscripts. Still, you are surrounded by everything that was touching his life, so it's inevitable that you feel that sense of connection to him.
Yeah, and there's more, isn't there? Because this is not just a very authentic house which reflects the personality of Charles Dickens, but it's also a unique resource for scholars of Dickens and people who you've got an enormous holding of material related to the writer, haven't you?
We do. We have well over 100,000 items in our collection, and that includes an incredible research library and archive. And like many museums, we don't know exactly what we have in our collection because not all of it has been catalogued, and that's particularly the case for the archive material. So we actually partner University of Buckingham in delivering an MA in Dickens studies, and that's focused on doing original research on material in our collection. We also have 2 PhD students with Royal Holloway just finishing off their dissertations at the moment as well. It's a really rich collection from that perspective. So in addition to what visitors see on display, we have a whole wealth of material behind the scenes still being devoured and investigated.
So you say that this was very much a family home. In fact, I believe that 2 of Dickens' children were actually born here.
That's right. When he moved in, he was just turned 25, and he and his wife Catherine were celebrating their first wedding anniversary. And the first of what would be 10 children was Charles Dickens Jr. Charlie was just a matter of weeks old. And they had their second and third children here, Mary and Katie, so 2 girls. And they were about to have their fourth when they actually moved from here over to Devonshire Terrace at the top of Marylebone High Street.
Yes, but as well as having a lot of happy memories, it was a time that was tinged with sadness and tragedy.
It was, yes, very unexpectedly. They had a family tragedy. Moved in here at the end of March, and in May, just 6 weeks later, Catherine's younger sister Mary Hogarth, was staying with them. She was helping out around the house and with young Charlie. They'd been out for an evening at the theatre and came home, had supper, went to bed, and in the night Mary cried out in terrible pain and lapsed into unconsciousness and died here in this house the very next day from what we know now as a brain aneurysm. And a devastating tragedy for Catherine and for Charles. He loved her like a sister, and it was such a pain. It's the only time he ever missed a writing deadline in his whole life, that tragic moment. And in fact, Catherine was pregnant and she miscarried, so it was a double tragedy for the family.
Yes. And how was Dickens, the great artist that he was, able to channel that deep personal sadness in a creative way, in your opinion?
He did everything. I think people read Dickens's novels and we assume he's made this up, he's conjured up these characters, but he based so much on his own life story. There's a bit of Dickens's experience in everything he wrote. David Copperfield is obviously the most autobiographical, but inspired by and as a tribute to Mary Hogarth, he introduces her in a number of different characters. The first time is about a year after she dies. The character Rose Maylie in Oliver Twist is introduced, and Rose, if you remember, she gets very ill, is on the verge of death, but doesn't die. It's almost Dickens is able to have the power of saving her from death. So Rose Maylie survives. A few years later, spoiler alert.
Now, careful, because I think I know what you're going to say. I'm reading The Old Curiosity Shop at the moment. It's one of the few I've never read, but I think it might not turn out very well.
But Little Nell is very much based on Mary. So Mary became this figure that stayed with Dickens, and he almost had to exorcise that demon out of his system through his writing. And he did that with so many different characters. One of the novels he wrote when he was here in Doughty Street is Oliver Twist, and we have a letter in our collection where he's writing to a friend of his, someone who was a journalist when Dickens was as well, and saying that he's looking for a magistrate to base a new character on for his next monthly part. And he says, I've heard about your Mr. Lyme at Hatton Garden police station, the magistrate associated with that. I've heard of your Mr. Lyme, but I've never seen him. And in order to properly describe him in my novel, can you secret me in so I can have a look at him one morning, because I want to be able to conjure him up very closely. So Mr. Fang is based on Mr. Lyme. And he was always doing that, basing new characters on real life people, and often only very thinly disguising them. That's why he wanted to be able to look at what Mr. Lang looked like, because he knew his readers would know exactly who he was talking about.
And architectural features as well. He introduces things which he's closely observed.
Yes, and that's why people today will wander around London and still feel Dickens's London, because he described everything in such great detail. And I think that's one of the things about contemporary novels, that we don't get the lengthy descriptive passages that Dickens is known for, because of course we have a shorthand now. If you were writing a novel and you wanted to describe the Taj Mahal, you just need to say the Taj Mahal. Everyone has seen a picture of it and can conjure up what that means. You might refer to its whiteness or its towers or domes, but you wouldn't have to describe it in that pictorial sense. But Dickens was describing everything so forensically, because people didn't have the sort of pictures in their minds of the
and
places.
of course, he personally observed every detail. He would have made a great Blue Badge tourist guide, because we're trained to walk the streets of London, and Dickens knew them intimately because he went everywhere on foot.
Absolutely, that was one of his great traits, and again part of his creative process was walking around, observing people and buildings and situations, and getting a sense of the London landscape. That's why he can conjure it up. It's so evocative in his writing, because he was there amongst it.
Now, I imagine being director of the Charles Dickens Museum must seem like Christmas and Easter and winning the National Lottery on the same day. What is the most rewarding part of the whole experience for you?
Oh, it's a wonderful job, dream job, really. But today, this reopening day is really reminding me of what matters, and I've been the greeter on the front door, welcoming visitors, checking them in, getting them on their journey through the house. And that to me is such a pleasure, because we're here to open up this wonderful house and collection and open up the world of Dickens and his writing to people from all over the world. And that's been a pleasure this morning to welcome people back. I expect there to be a lot of local Londoners, and there are, but I'm also really delighted to see that there are visitors coming back to London. So we've had quite a few tourists, either tourists from other parts of the UK or indeed from further afield already today. So that really cheers me on.
And to lure these visitors in, if you had to sum up Dickens' achievement in a few words, it's a big ask, what would you say?
Oh, well, he's not only an icon of British literature, he's also this beacon of London. He evokes London through his writing so clearly, with such passion and humour, and he's just created some of the greatest characters and wonderful storyteller. And I know a lot of people through this pandemic have found comfort in literature and rediscovering books that they haven't seen for years or have never read. And his work is timeless, because he's writing about real people, places, situations. He was a contemporary writer, and so the freshness and humanity of what he was writing about then still translates to today. So I think he stands the test of time, because he deals with those big human themes and does it with such compassion and humour and sort of good grace. He can kick against the injustices of society, give a voice to people who don't have those voices, but he can do it in a way that is memorable and entertaining.
Someone once described him as the nation's best friend.
Yes, and it just feels like he, alongside Shakespeare, a literary great, but you think about words that have become defining of an epoch, and you have Victorian, you have Dickensian, you have Shakespearean, Elizabethan, but you don't, so there's something about how he captured the time. And of course he became a celebrity in his own lifetime, around the world. Around the world, his work was translated into numerous languages, and people come to this museum as a place of pilgrimage, somewhere where they want to connect very personally to the writer and how he lived his life and how he was inspired. And I think that's what makes coming to a museum a really important moment, because you can read the books, you can look at our collection online, you can read about what we have here at the museum, but until you walk through the front door and you're in the rooms where Dickens lived and wrote and entertained and grieved and laughed and all of those things, you get a real sense of how special it is to be in a place where he actually spent so much time.
Well, we're just delighted that you're back in business again, and wish you every success with the reopening. Let's just remind people who are tuning into this broadcast, what are the present arrangements which apply to visitors coming to the Charles Dickens Museum?
So we're asking everyone to book online in advance. We're allowing a limited number of people in every 15 minutes, so you can book a 15-minute slot and then spend as much time as you want to in the museum after that. We're currently opening on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays, but we're poised and ready to expand those hours as and when. Open 10 a.m. till 5 p.m. with last entry at 4 p.m. And all the details can be found on dickensmuseum.com.
Absolutely. And visitor numbers are important, because it must have been a tough time not having that visitor revenue.
Absolutely.
The museum and the staff.
We're an independent museum, and we are, I'm calling it a truly independent museum. We don't receive any regular public funding. We have to generate every penny we need by activity here on site. So admission fees, sales in the shop, in the cafe, and special events, private hires, corporate entertaining, film facilitation fees. So we found a variety of income streams. And when we had to close, almost all of that disappeared overnight.
I was going to say, you've got a lovely cafe here in Normans, for instance.
Yes, we're unable to reopen the cafe just yet because of social distancing, but we're hoping to reintroduce that as soon as we can. But we've had a tough time getting through these 4 months. We've been very fortunate to have some incredibly generous donors. We launched an appeal, which is still running, and we also got some support from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, their emergency grant scheme, and that's allowed us to reopen today and will help subsidise the income that we won't be generating through reduced visitor numbers over the next few months. So it's a great day to be reopening, but we know that we've still got a journey ahead of us.
Yeah, sure. Well, Cindy, it's been very nice talking to you, and we wish you every success with the reopening, and hopefully you'll be able, sooner rather than later, to be open all the time and welcoming those legions of people who are excited about Dickens and his legacy. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you so much for that intriguing look around what is one of London's most interesting and very special museums. If you're a big fan of Charles Dickens' work, and if you've seen any of his books, any adaptations or anything, you probably are a fan of his work, then do go and visit the museum at Doughty Street. It is a treasure trove of information about the great man himself. Thank you so much to Cindy Sughrue, who is the director of the museum, for allowing us in today. Also, thank you to Januja Shrikantha, who is the marketing manager for the Dickens Museum, for all her help in putting together today's programme. And also thank you to my colleague Vicky Bailey, who was down there doing the camera work for Tim as they took you around the museum. Now, if you want to know more about the museum, the best place to go is the Charles Dickens Museum website, which you'll find at dickensmuseum.com. There you can find all kinds of information about the great man and some of the exhibitions that the museum are holding. And you can also book your tickets online to go and visit the museum. At the moment, the museum is just open on a Friday to a Sunday, and you do need to book your tickets in advance. So simply go to the website, click on your visit, and that will take you to a link where you can buy tickets to go and visit the museum. Do keep your eye on the website, because as time goes on and the situation develops, the museum do hope to be opening on more days during the week. There's also an online shop, the Curiosity Shop. You can go there and you can browse many items of Charles Dickens memorabilia. So if you want your own Oliver Twist bowl with "Please Sir, I want some more" on it, this is the place to go. Oliver Twist, of course, written in that place, that house in Doughty Street that now houses the museum. Fascinating place to visit. If you want to know more about the London Guides, then guidelondon.org.uk is the place you need to go and visit. You can find out more about Tim Hudson there, the guide who took you around the Dickens Museum, just type in his name in the Find a Guide section. Or you can find out about Vicky Bailey, who did our camera work today, or any of our London guides, or you could just browse through our guides. If you click on London Blue Badge Tourist Guides, click on Find a Guide, then you will get a list of all the guides who are registered with the Association of Professional Tourist Guides. So that's worth exploring. Also on the website, you'll find out more about our tours. If you click on the tours option, it will show you all the different types of tours that our guides offer. And one of them is a Charles Dickens Museum talk and walk. So we will take you around the sites associated with Charles Dickens in London. It's a fascinating walk. And if you're interested in the man himself, then it's something you should consider booking. And we also do virtual tours as well. If you want a tour from your own living room, then look at the London virtual tour page. And if you want to book one of our guides, all you have to do is go down to the page at the bottom of your tour, just fill in this form and send it off to us, and 3 of our guides will get back and contact you and tell you about all they can offer as a London Blue Badge tourist guide in London. Thank you very much for joining us today. Hope we'll see you again soon, but from the moment, from myself and from Tim down at the Dickens Museum, it's goodbye.